Okay, the remainder of the chapter records a vision of the harvests. One single vision, two harvests, 14 through 20. Now John sees two different harvests, one of wheat and one of grapes. And we need to remember the context here. The context is the lamb's activity opposed to the dragon's. And we saw him victorious in Zion with 144,000. We saw his worldwide messages of the gospel and two warnings and the message for the saints. But now we see the two visions of the end of everyone else who is alive on the earth. And John starts with the harvest of the saints. So let me read that and then go through it. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, having a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple and crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Put your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest on earth is ripe." Then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. All right, looking right from the beginning, John was looking. The image that he saw was startling because he says, "Behold." It's something that's important, something that he's drawing our attention to. He's seeing new visions all the time, but he does not always introduce them with, "Behold." This is something that's bigger. A white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like the Son of Man. That image, those wordings, echo language from Daniel 7, which says, "I kept looking in the night vision, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like the Son of Man was coming." That same prophecy, that same language was used by Jesus when he applies it to himself in Matthew 24, talking about the end times, his second coming. It says, "And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory." Matthew 26:64, Jesus uses it when he is in his trial before the high priest in the Sanhedrin, and he says that specifically to the high priest, that you're going to see me coming in the clouds of heaven, referring to himself. And then Revelation 1:7, it's the very first thing John does as a pronouncement of victory and of joy in the beginning of the gospel. He's coming in the clouds of heaven. And that scene, it has a double role. When the Son of Man comes in the clouds of heaven, he comes to save his people. And he also comes to judge the wicked, to make things right. So here, when he's sitting on the cloud, it's a place of heavenly authority over the earth. In the short little verses, cloud is repeated 4 times. It's emphatic. And the cloud is white, it's pure, it's holy, it's light. There's no darkness. And the one who's sitting on this movable heavenly throne that's coming in is crowned with a golden crown. And that word for crown is that victor's wreath. And here, because it's a military context, it's a victor's wreath that he takes over. He conquers, and thus is sovereign. When someone in a military context was victorious in battle and had that wreath, that battle, that victory, implied that he is now sovereign over that territory. So here Christ is viewed as the one who is now is sovereign and is now coming to establish his sovereign rule. So, but notice here, everything here is positive. It's all looking towards the believers. And let me continue. It says that he's holding a sharp sickle in his hand. Carrying a sickle, it implies a harvest. What's a sickle? This is what a sickle looks like. There's a handle and there's a curved blade. And the sharp section is on the inside of the blade. And it's a sharp sickle. Notice that that's emphasized. It's sharp. Well, why would it be sharp? It's telling us by that image that when Christ harvests and swings a sickle, everything will be cut. Everything will be harvested. There'll be nothing left behind. He will make no mistakes. If you don't have a sharp sickle, you can harvest and just bend the stalks, and they won't be cut. By being sharp, nothing will be left. Notice in verse 15 it says, and another angel came out of the temple. So this is another angel, just like the ones that were flying through the mid-heavens. This is another angel. It's coming from out of the temple, from God's presence. This is God's directive. God is giving instructions to reap because the time is now. The time is here. Now you have to ask, okay, if this Son of Man on the clouds is Christ, doesn't he know the time? He tells us in Matthew 24, but of that day, the hour, an hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Now, how does that all work out? That's hard to understand, how all those details work out, how the Father knows something and the Son doesn't. I think what the point is in Matthew, and the point of it is here, is that it's the Father's directive. It's the Father's will. The Son carries out that redemptive work of the Father. And so here, the Son is fulfilling the Father's will completely. I think that image is there to give us that the Son, what he's doing, is in complete agreement, in alliance with what the Father desires and the Father has predestined. And he's saying, put your sickle in and reap, for the hour of reaping has come. Why has it come? Because the harvest of the earth is ripe. That word for ripe, it literally means to be dried up. And it's used of grains, of wheat. When those grains dry up, then they're ready to be harvested. And then it confirms to us that in verse 16, that he who sat on that cloud obeyed completely and swung his sickle over the earth, and the entire earth was reaped. So the task is finished. It's completed. So now let me tell you a story. Okay, there was a man who had a field, and he bought seed, good seed, and he put it all out. And while he went away from his field, sleeping in his house, someone that hated him came in, started putting weeds all in the field. So then when the good seed, the wheat, sprouted up, and it actually was fully grown, and it started to produce the kernels, the fruit, then all of a sudden, wow, look, there's all weeds all among it as well. And how do you know the difference? Well, one had fruit, one didn't. And his servants said to him, his other workers said, hey, didn't you plant good seed? Why is there so many weeds here? And the owner of the field said, it must have been that enemy. Came in and did this. And the servants said, the worker said, what do you want us to do? Should we go gather them up? And Jesus said, continued to tell the story and says, but he said, no, for while you are gathering up the tares, the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first, gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn. In the scriptures, when it talks about wheat and harvests, the wheat is always symbolic of God's people. And the weeds, the chaff, any other material is non-believers. These are other scriptures that talk about the image of a wheat harvest. And notice in this passage in Revelation, there's no mentioning of threshing the wheat. No mentioning of winnowing it. Threshing it is pounding it to separate the kernels of wheat from the rest of the stalk. And the winnowing is when you have this pitchfork-like object and you're on a high place where wind or breeze is coming in, you throw up both the little pieces of stalk with the grain. The grain is heavier, that falls, but the stalks that are lighter are blown away. And usually there's some kind of fence there to separate the two. There's no mention of that, separation. And usually when it talks about the harvest, there's a connotation of the stalks, the things that are left, they're thrown in the fire. None of that is given. Why? Because this is very positive. It's focused on Christ harvesting his people, gathering its precious wheat. That is why he's returning. That's the focus of his return. It's for his people. So this symbolic imagery of the wheat harvest pictures, number one, it pictures either the gathering of those believers during the tribulation at his second coming, if you hold to a pre-tribulational rapture position. These are believers during the tribulation who have come to Christ. He gathers them and protects them, and they are precious. Or, if you hold to a post-tribulational view, meaning the church will still be here during the tribulation, then this image of harvest is the rapture of the church at Christ's second coming. But either way, the point is still the same. God's believers during this time are precious to him. And he comes, and he reaps them, and he gathers all of them. None will be left behind. Now, John also sees a second harvest in verses 17 through 20. And let me start with verse 17. It says, "And another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Then another angel, the one who has the power of fire, came out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, 'Put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of earth, because her grapes are ripe.' So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and the blood came out from the winepress up to the horse's bridle for the distance of 200 miles. This is an amazing picture, and at the end there, it almost breaks the vision and shows more of the actuality. So let's start, though, with the vision. First, another angel is following God's instructions. It's coming out of the temple. It has another sickle. This is not like the Son of Man sitting on the clouds. This is another angel. And then a third angel comes out from the temple. This angel comes out who has a power over fire, came out from the altar. Now, there's two altars in the temple. There's an incense and the altar of burnt sacrifice. This is the altar of sacrifice. It's a place where God's is appeased, where his wrath is taken out over sin. Notice it says that this angel has the power over fire. In Jewish literature, angels were usually associated with elements, having authority over certain elements. And in fact, in Jewish literature, this angel has a name, and it's Purael. In Greek, Pur is fire. And this angel, we've already seen in Revelation 8, verses 3 through 5, that an angel had taken fire from the altar and swung it and cast it to the earth, which began the seven trumpet judgments, where we saw that God was casting his wrath onto earth in a limited way to warn them and show forth his glory and his power. So here as well, the other angel that has that power over fire came out of the altar and called with a loud voice to him and said, to put in your sickle. It connotes that this is the ultimate judgment. This is the final judgment, where they will have to pay for their sins on the altar themselves. In fact, the altar, the fire, is going to them. Notice it says, because the grapes are ripe. Literally, they're in bloom, and it's used figuratively for the bloom of someone's life. So these grapes are at the perfect time of their life. They're at peace. They're in enjoyment. They have everything, and they're about to be destroyed. So interesting here, because this is clearly grape harvest, but sickles are not used for grape harvests. They're far too large and clunky, and they will destroy the vine along with it. And so what we see here is there's no concern about that vine or continuing to produce these grapes. It's over. So whereas wheat is always used of God's people, grapes being trampled in scriptures are used for the judgment of the wicked. Let me show you just a couple of passages. In Joel 3:13, the text says, "Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great." Isaiah 63:6, "I trod down the people in my anger and made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth." And you can see Jeremiah 25, Isaiah 5 as well, Isaiah 63, 2 and 3, and also Lamentations. Just a few other passages that talks about the wicked being like grapes that will be trampled in God's wrath. Now, what I have shown here, there's obviously a cultural image as far as a wine press. These are two wine presses. This first one here is a small one. The grapes would be placed here and squashed, and then the liquid would come down, and you can see there's a funnel here will be collected. This is a far greater one, larger one, and you can see there's a wall that surrounds it. That's that wall here where there's a channel where that juice would come down and be collected in these vats. In the process, what we see here is a structure here where grapes would be poured out here, and then with feet, they would be trampled. And the juices will run from the grapes, they'll be squashed, and then through some kind of opening, the grape juice would flow, and you would either gather it as it flowed down, or when it was in the bath, they would use cups and pour it into these containers. This was a scene of great joy. This was the harvest. And it's so here as well. This is a scene of joy because divine justice is being carried out for those who refuse to repent. And the image here of this grape juice, as you can see, it's red. It looks like blood. And it's used that way in Scripture. So here the image is the blood is flowing like a sacrifice. The life of the wicked will be spilled. Now look back at our passage in verse 20. And the winepress is trodden outside the city, and the blood came out from the winepress up to the horse's bridle for a distance of 200 miles. Notice, the wine's not collected. It goes out. That blood goes out all over. It flows as deep as a horse's bridle. It's probably about 4 to 5 feet tall. And as far as 200 miles. Literally in Greek it says 1,600 stadions, which in more accurate terms, it's about 184 miles. Some see that number as being symbolic, as a symbolic number meaning the whole world. The blood will be spilled and spread out through the whole world. But if you're looking at it more literally as 184 miles, that's an approximate length from the northern border of Israel to the southern border of Israel. And to me, it seems to be far more likely that Christ comes back, the blood flows as wide as all of Israel, cleansing it. The people who worship the beast, his image, the non-believers who defile the land, their blood now will cleanse it. They'll be paid for it. So thus you see here, deep and wide. And that is that image of a horse's bridle and blood flowing like rivers. That's used in ancient literature in war stories to convey a complete slaughter, a complete victory. So here it's emphasizing that they're no match for the lamb. When the lamb comes, it's going to be a complete slaughter, a complete one-sided victory. And notice that the winepress was trodden outside the city. The city will be spared. But that image of being executed outside the city, it has a connotation of being cut off from the covenant people when it refers to people. And we see this image in Revelation. Revelation 22, 14 through 15, it talks about the faithful enter the city, but the wicked are kept outside. So city, it's a covenant people. It's a fellowship. It's being with God in his city. So the image there of the winepress being trotted out outside the city is they are away from the presence of God in his covenant fellowship, where they will be tormented forever. they will lose their life. Now, in Israel's history, this also points to another sacrifice. In the Day of Atonement, the sacrifice for sin, the animal was sacrificed and burned outside the city. The blood was taken in, but the animal was sacrificed and burned outside, and that was for the sins of the people. And that could explain why there's another angel, one who had the power over fire, came out of the altar, because just like in that one, that fire from the altar had to go outside of the city to burn that sacrifice. And the altar where God's appeasement for sin had to go out to them, outside the city, where they would be atoning for their sins and paying for their sins throughout all of eternity. Because Christ is our atonement. We see that in Hebrews 13:12. Therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Christ was our atonement sacrifice. But if you don't partake of Christ, you will be that sacrifice. You will have to pay for your sins. And that will be outside the city, apart from God's community and apart from him. And that's a picture of the two harvests. Harvest of the saints and the harvest of the wicked. And those are the three pictures of the end. If your end comes before Christ, you are still blessed. You will enter into his rest. If you are his at his coming, you won't be left behind. He's coming for you. His coming is primarily for you. But his coming also connotes a judgment on those who reject him. And it'll be carried out with his angels as well. So now let's turn to applications. Number one, while we are alive on earth, being in the Lord means that we will have hard labor before us. However, when that work is finished, the death of the believer is an entrance into eternal rest. It's a blessing. We will be with Jesus. The Spirit bears witness to us on earth in the empowering of the believer to live and act according to our faith, to have deeds of righteousness, of works that proclaim Christ. Make this testimony of God part of your foundation so that it will bring you greater hope in his promise, that death is a blessing, greater love for his salvation, the blessing that you have, the hope that you have, and a greater faith to live for him now. Number two, salvation and judgment are decisive and mandated from the throne. We saw this throughout the passage. An angel comes out of the temple with God's instructions, and it happens. When Christ comes, he is coming back for his people, and no one will be left behind. This is part of God's plan. This is part of the Father's directives, and Christ makes that redemption complete. And then number three, when Christ comes in judgment, there's no contest. There's no battle. He will slaughter his enemies and cleanse Israel with their blood. He will destroy his enemies outside the city, away from the fellowship of God, and it will be complete, and their end will be quick. And that is the pictures of the end. Revelation 14, 13 through 20.